Welcome to the Strange and Interesting Podcast, a show about folklore, the paranormal, urban legends, and pretty much anything else I happen to find strange and interesting. I am your host, Al. And joining me today, I've got a guest, Joao, and we actually met on a Facebook group called Podcast Nation, which is a group that it serves as networking for people who do podcasts. So if you are ever interested in finding guests, or if you want to be a guest, you can post on this group. And Joao had offered to come on to talk about some Peruvian folklore. Thank you very much for joining us today, and welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Al. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you for the shout out for Podcast Nation. It has been a great way to help connect with others and just share a little bit more about these cultures that are sometimes forgotten,
Yeah, and I think with Peruvian folklore, at least coming at it from, having lived in North America all my life, it's not something that is really taught much in schools. I think when I was in history class, we maybe studied a little bit of some of the South American civilizations, like the Incas, and okay, I'm sure there's others. I just can't quite remember some of the names right now. This is definitely going to be an educational experience for me because it's, like I said, something I'm not familiar with. And, I always certainly enjoy learning about things that I don't know a lot about.
Yeah, no, it's always great. And even then, what I'm going to share with you is also limited because even though educational systems here have failed to talk much about it, even growing up in Peru, I remember we had some like folk stories that we talked about the Incas and other civilizations that were before the Incas. But even then, that information was limited, and it wasn't until I became an adult that I was able to get access to more information about it. Really.
So before we begin, why don't you introduce yourself? So if you have a podcast you do, if you want to talk a little bit about your background or experience with this type of folklore.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So my name is Joao Vilca Soto. I was born in Peru, and I came to the U.S. about 20 years ago. Ever since I came to the U.S., a lot of my focus has actually been in sustainable development. So I study a lot about the environment, how to take care for it, as a personal passion of mine. But through that research about how we take care of our environments, I came across a lot of situations or circumstances where there was this like example of great environmental action happening, and a lot of those cases were happening around South America, around the places where ancient communities, were still had some kind of an influence, which kind of gave me more of an inspiration to dive deeper into the cultures that I share as well, but that I never really paid much attention to them until it became more of an environmental fight as well. But myself, I am indigenous to the Peruvian Andes. My grandparents owned a farm by Lake Titicaca. So geographically speaking, they were part of the Uru group of the indigenous Andeans of South America. But the Moche, which is the people that I'm talking about, is more of a culture of the culture where I grew up in. Even though my family and grandparents were from the more of the central mountainous area of Peru, I grew up in the coast, and the coast is where the Moche actually lived. So I was able to visit some of the museums we had down there to learn more about the Moche culture and their practices and their social systems and everything. And yeah, I'm excited to talk more about it now too.
So in brief, what was the Moche civilization like? Could you mention that? So the part of the civilization was closer to the ocean, and then you had another part that was more in the mountainous regions. Now, are they still considered one distinct social group, or are they considered different civilizations?
hmm So the Moche are the people that were more considered to be the coastal dwellers. Now, I know a lot of their settlements kind of did move a little bit more inward, but primarily they were the ones that were defined as the fishermen. Um, their lifestyle was actually quite developed. They had architecture, which they usually made it out of, what's it called? Adobo, which is, sorry, trying to say from Spanish to English, sometimes you forget the words, but it's like That clay and sand mix.
Adobe
Or
or
yeah, Adobe. Yeah,
okay.
yeah. But they made them out their homes out of that. They also were making a lot of ceramics out of it as well. And the mochi are most commonly known throughout Peru and the archaeological community for their very intricate ceramics that they have left for us. Which is actually one of the few ways which we know so much about the moche because they would create ceramics about their daily lives as well. We have representations of them washing their hair, of them um, cooking meals and everything, even going through healing practices, and that was all depicted through their ceramics. And another fascinating fact about them too, regarding the fishing that they did, they embarked on this practice, which is called caballitos de totora, which means like little horses of totora. And what the Andeans would do, they would take this plant called the totora plant, and it would grow along the coast, along waterside. And after growing it, they would harvest it, and they would make these like surfboards, like half
Hmm.
surfboards out of them. And with those, they would embark out into the waters and be able to fish way more easily with that. And that's a practice that's still being used today for a lot of artisanal fishing too. Hmm.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I've heard how there were some Pacific cultures that did use surfing boards for fishing, where nowadays, of course, we're just used to seeing people do it as a competitive sport or just for fun. But that is cool that they still do that. They still use surfboards for fishing purposes.
Yeah, no, and the Totoro practice is something that kind of took it spread throughout the Andes because then you see cultures around Lake Titicaca, some of the inner lakes in the mountainous area where they would build homes in the water on these floating spaces made from these reeds that would grow on the water. And you grow more reeds and then that would keep building up your home and you have a home that lasts for a long time. Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard about. Now, didn't the Aztecs do something like that where they also had the floating cities, or was that just for the Incas?
No, the Aztecs as well. In their capital, they had the Chinampas, I believe is what they're called, and they were the system where because they had a lot of wetlands, they would create some growing beds amidst the more heavy marshy areas. They would hold them up with walls made from reeds and other grasses and such, and they would make these walls hold dirt, and they could grow a lot of food in wetlands, um, which provided them with a lot of water access for their plants, allowed them to grow a variety of different foods. And it's a great way of using wetlands, something that a lot of times we see as, kind of waste property or something you can never work with.
Hmm. Now, did the Mochi people have any sort of written language, or or is all what we know about them come from? You mentioned like the ceramics, the pottery. Did they have any sort of like stone carvings they used, or how else do we know about their civilization and their day-to-day life?
hmm So they did not have a written language. Actually, I don't believe any of the Andean civilizations had a written language. A lot of their communication happened through spoken word by speaking Quechua and a variety of other languages. And they did have another system of communication where they use knots and strings to kind of record messages and amounts and quantities or whatnot. But reading that is something that we still have yet to figure out. We don't know exactly how knots were used. But apart from their ceramics, they also embarked in architecture and they built huge temples throughout their cities and such. And within they also left some carvings and some representations of their lives, their battles and such too, through those works.
Yeah, that's interesting that you said that they communicated with knots, and unfortunately, so it sounds like we don't know anything about what the meanings were. How did that work? Was it just like a string or a rope that had a certain number of knots tied into it, or was there a different style of knot they used?
hmm So the process is called quipus, and from my understanding is they appear to be like a necklace. So they usually have one circular ring, and then off of that circular ring, they will have a lot of different strings coming out of it, and each one will have different numbers of knots at different locations and such. But it was like a collection of knots they would have on a line of strings, and it definitely has some sort of meaning because you can see that the knots are intricately placed in certain locations. But still, that's the rest of that is a mystery that I hope one day we'll find out. It'd be really cool.
So with their civilization, so sounds like they did establish cities, so they weren't very, they probably weren't nomadic. They tended to stay in one place, raise crops, raise animals.
Yeah, no, they also embarked in agriculture and they had some fascinating irrigation systems. And this was a culture that I believe the timeline goes, so they were around from about 100 after Christ to about 800 after Christ AD. Um, but they had irrigation systems and they grew variety of crops. They grew potatoes, sweet potatoes, yucca, which is kind of like a cassava plant, the variety of fruits, passion fruits, guavas, guanábanas, a bunch of fruits that you don't hear about much, very much about here because it's different climate, different weather. But yeah, no, it was fascinating what they did with that.
Okay, so what do we know about Mochi religion and cosmology? How did they view the world and the universe around them?
Now, specifically to the Moches culture regarding their cosmovision, which is what the Andes refer to as their worldview, that one's kind of very limited. But we do have some ideas of what the worldview was based on other religions as well that were in the area. And because even though a lot of times people grow up hearing that most of Mesoamerica wasn't very connected, like the Aztecs and the Incas never made contact, that was actually false. A lot of them did make contact and they traveled all over. So there was a lot of like influences of similar ideologies. But I'm spending some time studying the Andean worldview because I think it has some great lessons to teach us, especially with climate change and reciprocity. That is their law. But with that worldview, a lot of it is not really about good and bad. They don't really have as much of a not a moral compass. They don't have a an idea that if somebody is bad, there's like really repercussions for that. It's more about the fact that if you're bad, if you do something that might be considered bad, you become more chaotic, more confused, more lost, more stressed out, and you're out of balance. And that's more of the idea what they have is are you in balance with the world around you, or are you out of balance with it? And a lot of the cultures, a lot of the stories that we see from those cultures, do talk about this idea that you have to be in balance with the world and that a lot of greatness comes from surrendering to that balance. And you see a lot of other cultures and religions around the world talking about surrendering to the greater flow of things, and they were humans just like us. They just interpreted it in different ways.
Do we know if they had a concept of like an afterlife, or was it mostly just the? Because I found it was fascinating. You were saying that it seems their belief was that if you were doing something you weren't supposed to or going against the natural order of things, that you would start to feel guilty or that you would suffer some sort of mental or emotional turmoil from that.
hmm So yeah, they regarding the aspect of afterlife, it wasn't really like an aspect of like after this world I'll be entering another world. For them, it was more of an idea that kind of like reincarnation, where the world that we have here um, is the same world that will be shared by our children and the same world that was shared by our parents, and it's kind of just of a cycle. There's some stories from ancient Andeans where they talk about the fact that I am creating, like a person will speak about their life as I am creating this life here for my father because they understood that their fathers did that for them as children, but going through the cycle of life of birth and rebirth, they understand that even though I've been caring for my father, by caring for my child, I'm also kind of caring for my father because he's still passed on through our generations. Um, and this kind of helped with in some ways not really creating like an idea that I want to avoid doing bad things in this life because I want to avoid maybe going to hell, as some Western ideas see it. But it was more about I want to live in balance because that kind of helps create balance in this world for when I return to this world, for when other people that I love return to this world. If we create it with harmony, it's easier for them to live in harmony as well.
So yeah, that sounds some of that almost sounds similar to like Taoism and Buddhism and some Eastern religions. I have a degree in religious studies, so I find stuff like that interesting.
Yeah. No, I find that stuff to be so fascinating, and I've read like the book of the Tao, and it's simple, direct, but even that one kind of helped me provide with additional perspectives that I think also helped me understand Andean cosmovision as well more.
So the as far as how they viewed the universe around them, did they, because a lot of times in religions there's different models, like in Northern Europe, the idea of the world tree, or other like the biblical world, they usually picture the earth with the like the firmament and the heavens above, and then the underworld. Did they have any sort of cosmological models that we're aware of?
Yeah, and actually, the Moche, along with a lot of Andeans, saw the world also kind of split up into three worlds, into the upper world of the heavens. They usually connected that not so much as a heaven you can see, but as the world actually up there. And the animal that best represents that side of it is the condor. They saw the condor as the bird that connects our world to the upper world because it was the bird that would fly up, you know, thousands of meters up in the air and almost like he could disappear into the clouds. So for them, it's like, yes, he's going to the heavens. Additionally, they lived they had the idea of our regular world too being one of those worlds, represented by Jaguar, and was a world of strength and a world of life, and that's the world we live in. And then they had an idea for an underworld as well, which was often related with the snake. The snake goes underground, and it was also kind of like a messenger for the underworld for that. Um, Now I don't know specifics for the mochas regarding like the relationship between one world to the other, but I do know that other Andean cultures saw it that like if you were not so much in harmony, you might end up in the underworld, yes, but that was not like the end all to be all. Like that was a space where you'll have opportunities to come back to this world and eventually make it to the upper world as well.
So yeah,
Yeah.
again, that sounds a lot like Hinduism and Buddhism, where there's this belief of how, if you die, but there's still a chance you can come back and still achieve enlightenment and escape the cycles of rebirth.
hmm
Now, do we know if they had any sort of creation myth, or how they viewed the creation of the universe?
Yeah. Again, I don't know if that's specific to the mocha, but I do know that a lot of Andean cultures were uh, they believed in the creator god Viracocha, which is something I found very, very fascinating to the fact that this a lot of cultures kind of see a figure, a creator god, being the one that gives them life. But for them, Viracocha was the creator god that created the sun and the moon, and and then the sun and the moon ended up creating more of the earth and have those connections. Something I really enjoy about Viracocha though is that it's a figure that you can see it in some of the earliest and very earliest of like just ruins that are left from these ancient cultures, and it's figured as a large creature with like the sun coming out of his head and usually snakes running down his face, kind of like rivers signifying the water that flows from him. Um, but that is their creator god. They have that idea as well.
Okay. Now, sometimes in different types of folklore and religion, there's different themes that we often see that are pretty common. Like, if you look in like folklore, for example, well, I guess the best way if you're familiar with Joseph Campbell and the monomyth of the heroic initiation, how
Mm.
there are certain themes that are common in these legends, like the descent into the underworld, receiving assistance from some sort of mentor figure, receiving some sort of magical gift, uh, the atonement with the father god or the mother goddess or the ogre mother figure. Are there any sort of common themes or motifs we see in Moshi religion and folklore?
The one moche story that I would talk about the most, just because it's one of the most prevalent, is the story of Ai Apaec. And in that one, he does go through a moment where he goes to the underworld, and at this point, he does meet a shaman owl goddess, and the owls were also seen as creatures of wisdom, um, and she also embarks with them. Not really any special powers within the story at this point, but like the gift of healing for him. And so there is a bit of the same aspect of the journey of the hero as you mentioned, but at least with the story of Ai Apaec, we can go into a bit more with the next question over this one, but it, the trajectory is definitely different than most stories, which is cool.
Okay, so it does have. So if you were to look at the legend in the context of Campbell's idea of the monomyth, we'll certainly see some parallels, but they're not always in the same order that Campbell usually put them in.
Mm-hmm. And maybe not, and yeah, the order might be a little different, but also the goal of the story, I feel like it changes. That this may be also but from my understanding, is that a lot of those heroic views are regarded as the hero is seeking out some sort of like self-validation, some sort of glory, or not even for himself, for his community. And there is some of that here. But also I feel like it changes too. Um, but yeah, I can tell you more about the story if you like.
That sounds good. So
Yeah,
let's move into the story of, and I apologize, it was pronounced I or AI APEC?
Ai Apaec, I believe
I
how it's
okay.
pronounced. Yeah, again, it's ancient languages, so could be different. Now, the story that I'm going to share with you is a story of Ai Apaec that I found as presented by a museum's exhibit on Andean gold and the golden empires of Peru. But in that, they share the story of the mythological superhero Ai Apaec, who is a leader of the Moche, who farm the green, fertile valleys of northern Peru. Now, the story goes that as the sun sets, as it does one time, Ai Apaec becomes alarmed that his land will be enveloped forever in total darkness, and he's determined to then retrieve the sun so that there could be more sunlight and more warmth and more energy for his farmland and for his people as well. So he embarks on a journey, and the journey that we go over, it kind of helps to characterize the Andean circle of life. Through the journey, he travels to three worlds, facing formidable challenges. He gains superpowers, sacrifices his life, and returns home reborn, ensuring the continuity of life. So Ai Apaec is here in the Mocha land, and he sees that the sun is setting. So to respond to this, Ai Apaec gets atop his buzzard, a bird that flies out, with his magic lima beans and his friends by his side, which include a lizard and a dog. So Ai Apaec was very unique, very connected with the animals around the area, that they were his friends, and they helped him go on his journey. So up atop the buzzard, they fly into the mountains where the sun is setting behind them. But upon getting there, they discover that the sun has already left, and they chase its fading rays over to the edge of the ocean. And it makes sense as you see people that live among the valleys of the mountainous area. If they go above the mountains, they see a huge ocean, and their imaginations can only tell them so much about what it's about. So, following the ocean, Ai Apaec encounters the crab, who's considered the guardian of the entry of the sea. Now, Ai Apaec is a young, strong Moche warrior, and he fights the crab, but does not kill him. Instead, he lets him live, so that the castration will bestow upon Ai Apaec the power of strong, hard legs. With the superpower, Ai Apaec can clamber over the rocks and sand and follow the sun into the world of the ocean. So now we have our hero entering the ocean depths. And as he enters deeper into the ocean, Ai Apaec confronts the Strumbus, a giant snail with a large spiraling conch shell, also referred to as the Patutu. And this allows him to communicate with gods, but it also holds the perpetual natural cycles of life. And something very peculiar about this specific reference to the spiraling shell and the circles of life, I've read about other cultures throughout the Americas that also refer to as that weaving, as that like circular pattern that you see in shells and other natural elements, sort of like the a weaving aspect that was left to us by our Creator God. And also, you can follow that same pattern to do some knitting practices as well, and that some other cultures use that to make bags and such and other products. But after defeating the snail, Ai Apaec evicts him and climbs into the conch shell, covering himself in this invincible armor. And now that he's defeated two creatures, he has more power. He dives deeper and deeper into the oceans and confronts the most powerful deity of the sea, the fearsome Decapitator, part shark, part ray, and part sea lion. But Ai Apaec is weak and from fighting and greatly aged, so he's no match for the Decapitator, who grabs his head, swiftly slicing it off with a knife. And here we see our hero greatly defeated, despite all the journeys and all the successes that we have seen. But now that the hero has passed away, he must leave the land of the living. But supported by two of his birds, Booby and a vulture, he descends into the land of the ancestors, referred to as the underworld. And here is where he meets this sh- shaman owl, but also Mother Earth. But what the shaman owl does, they help heal Ai Apaec, and as said in the story, um, Pachamama also Ai Apaec unites with Pachamama, the earth and fertility goddess, whose formidable female powers make him whole again. And fertilized by Ai Apaec, the Pachamama gives birth to the tree of life with its germinating fruits, and life is guaranteed to continue. So despite his long journey trying to achieve greatness of the sun for his people, he still gets defeated, but that's not the end of the story. Even after being defeated, he's still able to connect with nature. And in that process of connecting with nature, he's able to still bring life and security for his people despite that. So it kind of helps, in my opinion, to depict a journey of life that sometimes a lot of people find themselves in, where we're born and sometimes we compare ourselves to a lot of the journeys of other people have done, and that sometimes motivates us to go on our own journeys of success and grandeur. Um, and some of us do, and some of us, get great adventures and great stories out of it. I don't know if any of us have defeated any crabs. Definitely not the decapitator yet, but um, but uh, but despite it all, even after all those journeys of grandeur and great fights, um, there still comes a time where you're gonna grow weak, you're gonna grow old, and at that point, life still goes on. So what do you do next? And the story kind of nicely puts it that even when you feel defeated, you can lay back down with the earth, and the earth will heal you, and it will continue on as long as you also work on healing it. So, yeah.
Yeah, I understand what how you were saying before, how a lot of times the environmental issues that we talk about, how it does kind of lead back to these ancient civilizations, because there was more of that emphasis on oneness with nature, and being able to conserve the land so that it can provide the food and the sustenance you need. I liked the part of the story we're talking about, the descent into the ocean. I mean, at first I thought, okay, that sounded more like the descent into the underworld that we hear about in a lot of stories, but I think it could also be symbolic of the abyss, because a lot of times in ancient cultures, the ocean is the embodiment of chaos. And I think it's for one of they probably saw it like that for one of the reasons you mentioned, how, when we look at, long ago, when we only knew so much about the oceans, you look at it, you could only kind of imagine what was below there. And I think it would be interesting to see if some of the ancient people were to know some of the things about the ocean we do now, how would they view that?
Exactly, because you see them talk about certain species with grandeur, and even I growing up, and I grew up across the sea from the ocean. I remember even living with stories about these wonderful creatures that sometimes they saw, giant squids and such. And later in life, you hear more about them being real, and it just makes it all so much more fascinating to have all that. Um, but it would be also awesome to see how they would interpret more of like the world that we know, the more of the world that has been recorded and has been shared with one another, and how they relate to it. I think would be fascinating.
Are there any other major stories from Moshi folklore or religion that you'd like to share?
Specific to the Moche, not that I'm aware of. Not too many other stories that I've heard from them. I'm hoping to find more with time. But I do want to talk a little bit about another book that I found and it's called the Warochiri manuscript. Now, when we're talking about the lack of a written language, the Warochiri manuscript actually came to life after the effects of colonization. So some Andeans had learned Spanish and had learned the Spanish alphabet, and they were able to use that as a way to kind of record the sounds of their language. But here's a book that was written, and it talks about the Andean the religion and their view of the world and everything. Um, and it was created because a Catholic priest had asked an Andean person to write out their language and their religion. It was later used to kind of help shift views of the people from the Andes to more of a Catholic viewpoint. But it was done because there were similarities. You were talking about, the idea of, heaven, the earth, and hell. They had idea of the three worlds, and that was used as a way to kind of help turn their religious views into a mixed view with Catholicism. Um, but the story, I have yet to work to the book, and it's a lot of its stories are still kind of left in a masquerade of how to interpret it because they are spoken with a completely different concept of the way life goes on. That's what I heard the story. That's where I read the story of the son who was taking care of the world for his father, just emphasizing that idea that it's all just a cycle. Um, but that's a wonderful resource. I'm hoping to learn more stories from that. Maybe I can share more in the future as well regarding the other cultures. Um, but other fascinating stories, other very popular folklores. Um, Unfortunately, and not that I want to speak of unless until I have more certainty that they're from these cultures, because I also see that a lot of times the stories that certain folklores are mixed in with like the folklore of other Mesoamerican civilizations and such, and I think it would be nice to kind of have more clarity of which ones for which. So,
So over time, as archaeologists and anthropologists have started to study these ancient cultures, their legends have become intertwined. So now it's just a task of deciding, okay, what's genuine and what came from a different culture.
It's a problem that I see a lot. I doesn't bother me too much. I still like the idea of having some interpretation of their stories to work with to try and understand them better. Um, but it's also about trying to find. I do want to do my best that when I share stories out, I find the most genuine story I can that can give us a more genuine look into how these people saw their existence in this world. Because it's the same world that we share now, and a lot of the issues that they face are the same issues we face today. Even you were talking about, how you see the connection with climate change and such. But a lot of Andean cultures, they had their civilizations ended because of climatic changes, from droughts, from floods. I should believe that the Moche civilization, one of the top theories for the end of their civilization, was because of floods from a very strong El Nino event. But then this kind of developed a group of people that were very in tune with how to deal with climatic changes. And then you see some of the later civilizations like the Incas, who were like the last formable civilization in South America that created, their temples, much like Machu Picchu was created with the intent that even if a flood rain happens, that water would just be able to wash through the city without causing landslides that would destroy the city, and it's still standing there hundreds of years later. So they had some knowledge that we could use today.
So obviously they did something right.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating because the way they did it, they would create the terrace farms and they would bring in sand and other materials from all around the country to build these very high quality, temples.
Yeah, it's amazing how some of these ancient structures do still stand after all these years, and which is nice because it gives us a glimpse into their past, and depending on what type of artifacts that archaeologists find there, it gives us a glimpse into their daily life and what their beliefs may have been. And when you're talking about how we have to be aware of the climate change, it brought to mind this saying from a geologist. I do not remember the guy's name, but it was like civilization exists with geological consent. And what he was trying to get, the point he was trying to get across is how, yeah, we do really have to know how the earth and how the climate works because, well, if we don't necessarily understand all that, it's eventually going to lead to our ruin.
Hmm.
Um, of course, in places where there's earthquakes, it's forced us to adapt, find ways to build buildings that are better able to withstand earthquakes. And I'm sure they do this in a lot of coastal regions where they put research into how to develop buildings that are going to be able to better withstand hurricanes and severe storms.
They do. But even then, we can't always understand. We can't always predict every challenge that comes up. And I remember hearing about some of the cities that are built in like the Pacific, like the Philippines area and such. And some of those cities that are built, they're built over ground that is more, it's not very compact yet. But then they built cities on top, and the weight of the cities helps push the ground and compact it more. And then you have cities that drop in elevation under sea level way faster than they expected them to because of this lack of planning. And I like how you mentioned that because, especially what the geologists say, because I remember reading about the Kogi people, and they have this process where if a person within their community wants to create a pot, like even a clay pot, they have to ask for permission from their elders to do this thing because the elders understand that whatever your clay you're getting for that pot is coming from somewhere else on the earth already doing its job. You hear about even places where coal gets mined out, but then you see arsenic being let out. And a lot of times, we use biochar as a way to kind of help filter arsenic from our waters. So it's like a lot of times we do mining operations and we remove stuff from the earth without considering what was that doing in the earth already in its first place for the last thousands of years.
That is a very interesting perspective when you talk about how getting permission to take clay because, yeah, that clay was there doing something and, yeah, you're taking it away. So, not a perspective that you hear on a regular basis.
Yeah, yeah, but it's fascinating, and it's really cool because actually the Kogi people it has been a civilization that, according to the records, is still being active today. It's still active today, and they've been just in hiding for like the last like 1,300 years. There's a cool book called The Heart of the World, and it's a book written by a BBC documentary filmmaker that was reached out to by the Kogi people, and the Kogi people reached out to this BBC filmmaker and be like, "Hey, we want to tell the world the message," and the message was about, "Hey, let's care for our planet, let's care for our rivers at least." But then this culture is able to, they have so much more of a deeper understanding of the ecological world, even without all the technologies that we have today.
Well, I'd like to thank you for joining me today, Joao. And before we leave, do you have like any website or do you have a podcast of your own or do you have any social networking information you'd like to share?
Sure, I'd love to. First off, thank you so much, Al, for this. I'm glad we made a time to meet, and thank you again for bringing light to these other stories of the world. But yeah, if anybody wants to help support, I have started a business called Incomerge, where I'm working on some clothes made with some of the designs of ancient Andean cultures. The clothes are all made from like mostly recycled plastic, about 95% recycled plastic, and the profits go to a nonprofit I started called Ruta Verde. We're working on reforestation and working on just kind of helping heal the land as our ancestors did, because we want to make sure that other people get to enjoy it as well. Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for listening, everyone. Thanks for joining me today, Joao. And until next time, everyone, stay strange and stay interesting. You have been listening to a presentation of Point of Insanity Game Studio. Visit us on the web at poigamestudio.com. Follow us on Twitter at POI Game Studio. Look us up on Facebook and email us at poigamestudio@gmail.com.